All right, as always, thanks everyone for joining in to our Suffer.net cross-platform user group. We do this once a month where the community gets together and we talk about everything that we can do in the .NET ecosystem to develop cross-platform apps. We have talked about Uno, we have talked about Maui, we have talked about Avalonia, we have talked about Blazor in the past, about Maui Blazor, but I'm really excited about today's topic. Today we have Shaun Walker. You guys basically know him as the founder of .NET Nuke. It's an honor to have him here. I have always looked up to him. I remember when we started using Blazor, as soon as Blazor started, we started using Blazor, Shaun, and it was like you were coming up with Octane, and it was like how he already see everything that is still on preview that he's already using, and in that time it was amazing to see the Octane Framework starting to develop. So he's going to give us a topic talk about building dynamic application with Blazor, and I can't wait. We have been waiting for this for like 2 months, and we met at the MVP Summit, so I'm really excited and really thankful to have you here. I know that a lot of our community members will love, and everyone who is not here will definitely be watching on YouTube later on. So, Shaun, I want to let you introduce yourself first, and then we can basically get started.
Okay. Yeah, so I'm Shaun Walker. I guess my claim to fame is that I was the original creator of .NET Nuke, which was a popular application framework and CMS that was created way back in late 2002. Yeah, so DNN, it was rebranded to DNN, I think in around 2013, 2014. Although the community had always used that DNN name to describe it. It's still around and going, but I spent basically the years from like 2003 through 2014 leading the DNN project. I actually created a company around it called DNN Corp. We raised 3 rounds of venture capital funding. So it was an interesting experience to go, through an open source project and then go through a venture-backed company as well. I left in 2014. I ended up going to work for one of our consulting partners who was doing DNN implementations. And so then I spent like 2014 through 2018 just working as a consultant, actually not doing a lot of DNN implementations, but doing a lot of just basic like .NET enterprise applications. The company that I had went to work for got acquired by another larger company, and then that company got acquired by Cognizant, which was obviously a huge company. And I spent quite a bit of time at Cognizant. Last year, I was operating as the CTO of professional services, meaning that I was focused on the professional services accounting firms like Deloitte, PwC, EY, and KPMG, as well as some of the mid-market firms. I left that job in March of this year with the idea that I would create my own consulting company and also get more serious about commercializing Octane. So yeah, that's what we're going to talk about today is the new framework that I'm working on, which is open source, called Octane.
Hey, Shaun, feel free to share your screen and go for it.
Okay. All right. All right. We're going to start with some slides just to set some context here, because I'm sure that not everyone has heard of Octane before. All right. And I've already kind of done the introduction. The only thing I guess I'll mention is that I was an MVP for many years, and then I actually was not an MVP for I think a period of 5 years. And so 2 years ago, I was able to become an MVP once again. I think it was largely based on my work with Octane. And then at the MVP Summit just this last spring is where I ran into Jose, and so that was great to connect with him. And then that's how we came up with the idea that maybe I could present at the Arizona.NET user group. So that's how I ended up here today. So we're going to talk a bit about Octane, and the fact that it's a modular application framework and CMS for Blazor and .NET MAUI. And I know that this user group is mostly focused on cross-platform, and so I'm going to make sure I focus quite a bit of the discussion about the cross-platform nature of Octane. Get rid of this. Let's move it up. Okay, so application frameworks. I think most of us are fairly familiar with what application frameworks are, but really, I mean, they're designed to accelerate the development of web apps and web services and APIs. And they do that by providing a standard way of building and deploying applications. And so rather than have you build everything from scratch, they try to automate a lot of the things that you would normally have to do in software development. Modular applications are different than standard applications in the sense that they're made up of a bunch of individual components that are then assembled at runtime to form a fully featured custom application. And when we're talking about Blazor, and I'm sure that most of you are familiar with Blazor and the component model, and because it's been around now for, I guess, 5 or 6 years, the standard way that you build Blazor applications, it does use components, but typically all of your components are declared within the same application. And the way that Octane works as a framework, it is much more modular in the sense that every feature that you're developing is actually a separate project, a separate assembly, and it is all combined together dynamically to compose your application at runtime. This notion of composability is something that has become quite popular again in the software industry. I think it's gone through cycles where it's been quite popular in the past as well. But composability is an area that seems to be getting a lot of focus lately. And so it's kind of, I guess, a little bit lucky that Octane is able to provide this functionality. The Octane framework itself, some of the goals behind it are that it was designed so that it can accelerate the development of modern applications, much in the same way that .NET Nuke was developed to allow developers to kind of accelerate their efforts in building web forms-based applications. Octane does the same thing using more modern architectural principles, and of course using Blazor and MAUI for the front end. So it provides a set of application building blocks and services to do some of the most common things that you would need to do in every application, and things that you shouldn't be building yourself. And again, these are also things that Microsoft doesn't provide out of the box as part of its tool set. These would be things like multi-tenancy, for example, is a fairly major feature that a lot of applications need. Microsoft has never provided multi-tenancy as part of its framework. And so this is where you would take advantage of a framework like Octane to provide that capability. Obviously, Octane is open source. It's using an MIT license, very same license that .NET Nuke used as well. It's probably the most popular open source license within the Microsoft ecosystem. And it is a .NET Foundation member project. I actually made the application not long after I created the project back in, I think, 2018. And initially it wasn't sort of large enough or established enough to be approved by the board of directors at the foundation. And so it took a couple of years before they approved it. But now it is a full member .NET Foundation project. It really is a pioneer in some of the capabilities of .NET Core, Blazor, and .NET MAUI. In particular, Blazor. The Octane Framework project was started way back when Blazor was still in its initial preview stages. And it has evolved a lot since then, but it is a really good working example of how to implement a lot of advanced techniques using Blazor. Conceptually, it's developed in a client-server manner. And the reason why it uses this particular type of an architecture is because it wants to cater to all of the different Blazor hosting models that are available. So of course, in Blazor, you have, Blazor Server, you have Blazor WebAssembly, and of course, you have Blazor Hybrid now as well. The only architecture that works across all of the different hosting models is the client-server approach. Obviously, if you were just building a standard Blazor application and you decided that you were only interested in implementing Blazor Server, then you wouldn't necessarily have to use a client-server approach, right? You could use a pure server approach in that kind of methodology. But the moment that you then wanted to enhance that application, perhaps, and make it work in a Blazor WebAssembly mode, you'd have to basically rewrite the application to make it client-server. And so that's why Octane has taken this conceptual sort of architecture approach, because it works for all of the different hosting models. So on the server side, of course, you've got .NET Core, you've got EF Core to do your data access. Octane has its own repository layer, which of course leverages EF Core. It supports multiple databases. So it supports SQL Server, SQLite, MySQL, and Postgres SQL. It did not support all of these databases from the very beginning. Initially, it was only supporting SQL Server. But of course, if you have an application and you want it to be truly cross-platform, then you need to support databases which run on those platforms as well. So there was a fairly major effort in, I think it was Octane version 2.1 to enhance it so that it could support multiple databases, multiple database engines, that is. On the server side, Octane also has a REST-based API. Some people would call this, like a headless CMS, meaning like it's got a set of APIs that you can take advantage of from the client side. And those APIs allow you to interact with the back-end server aspects of the application, even if you're not building a UI, right? You could use an HTTP-based approach to interact with the back end of the framework. Octane also supports the notion of scheduled jobs. It uses the .NET Core I-hosted service capability so that you can build scheduled jobs that basically can run independently from the application, but still within the same app service, and can run on whatever schedule you desire. It is modular, meaning each module that you develop, which is essentially a feature, has its own front end and its own back end. And so the back end APIs of various modules will, of course, be deployed to the server, and that's where they would run. And then you can have multiple databases. So the whole notion of a multi-tenant system is you can serve multiple clients from the same application. And whereas in older frameworks like .NET Nuke, you had a multi-tenant capability, but all of the data for all of the clients lived in the same database, Octane has the ability to actually have isolated tenants from a data perspective. So you can have distinct client information that's stored in separate databases on the server side. On the client side, you've got Blazor. And rather than taking an approach where the Octane server catered to multiple client technologies, which would actually be possible because, of course, there is this headless API that is available, Octane actually kind of went all in on Blazor as being the client technology for building user interfaces. And so, of course, it uses Blazor Server, and it can also support Blazor WebAssembly, and it supports Blazor Hybrid. And I think the important thing to note here is that there's a lot of talk right now about .NET 8, right? And in .NET 8, there's talk about the fact that you don't have to make a decision about, which Blazor hosting model you can use or you want to use in your application, because that was always a bit of a challenge when you were evaluating Blazor. It's like, what hosting model makes the most sense for my business problem that I'm trying to solve? Well, Octane, right from the very beginning, almost found a way that it could support all of the different hosting models within the same application. So I can have a installation of Octane running, and I can say that one of my tenants is running Blazor Server, and another tenant is running Blazor WebAssembly, and another tenant is running Blazor Hybrid. That all works seamlessly today, and you don't need .NET 8 for that. Also has a service layer, and basically that service layer allows you as a developer to build Razor components that then can use the services that are provided by Octane for interacting with the API in the back end, returning basically, strongly typed objects, collections, things that are easier to work with within your Razor component code. It has a composable UI framework that is included as part of Octane, because the idea in Octane is the front end of your application is completely dynamic. And what this means is that you can have, again, multiple tenants, so multiple clients that you're serving from the same installation. Each of those tenants is known as a site. So you can have, site 1 that responds on one URL and site 2 that responds on a different URL. And those are treated as completely separate logical containers within Octane. They could even have their own physically separate databases on the back end, which is serving that information. Inside of these sites, you can have an unlimited number of virtual pages. And this is, again, a very different concept than what you would use when you're building a standard Blazor application. Because when you're building a standard Blazor application, you build Razor components, and then you use the @page directive to basically provide a hint to the Blazor runtime that when it starts up, it finds all those attributes so that it basically builds a route table for you. Octane doesn't use that approach. It doesn't have the idea that a component equals a page. In Octane, a page is a virtual concept, and you can create as many of them as you want. It's basically just configuration. And so a site can have as many pages as you want, and then each page can have as many different components as you want on those pages. But they are not physically located like in a file somewhere, in a component file and embedded, right, statically. We're talking very dynamic here. So everything is assembled dynamically at runtime. As far as Razor components go, each module would be its own separate project, which has its own set of Razor components, would have its own set of services that you would build, and talking to its own set of APIs in the back end. And using this approach, you can build modules that actually, similar to the way that Octane can run on all of the different hosting models, modules can also operate in all the different hosting models as well. So you can basically build a single module using Razor components, and it can run in Blazor Server, Blazor WebAssembly, and Blazor Hybrid. In terms of multi-tenant configuration, so I think a lot of folks are probably familiar with multi-tenancy and the idea of basically, sharing the same installation for multiple clients. Often multi-tenancy is used to save cost. It sometimes can make the configuration of your environment much simpler as well, because you don't have to spin up a bunch of separate environments for each client. And so definitely for economies of scale, multi-tenancy has been a very popular concept over time. It's very complicated to build multi-tenant applications, however, and so that's why you would want to use a framework or a library like Octane to do that. Some of the different modes, of course, that are supported by multi-tenancy is you can have a fully dedicated mode on the left-hand side here, where you have a fully dedicated instance of Octane with its own database, only servicing one client. In the middle, you can have a shared model as well, where you have one instance of Octane installed, and you can have distinct databases or separate databases for each client. but the framework installation is shared between them. So in this particular case, all the clients that are on that instance, right, would be sharing the same memory from a client perspective. But the data itself would be separated. And then shared would be a model where, of course, you're sharing the framework installation between multiple clients and you're sharing the same database as well. So logically, your data would be stored with some type of an identifier. In the case of Octane, it's a site ID, which is able to then, partition the data so that it's physically or essentially logically separated from one another in the same database. Database support, SQL Server, SQLite, Postgres, and MySQL. Interestingly, it's not, when it comes to multiple database support, it's not just about supporting different operating systems. Like, of course, if you're using like a Windows-based server, you might use SQL Server, or if you used Linux, maybe you would use some of the other variations here. But it's also about supporting different environments, because often maybe your production environment might be using Azure and might be using SQL Server or Azure SQL, but in your local development, you might want to use something that's much more lightweight and less costly, like SQLite. That is completely possible with Octane as well. So the idea here is that if based on the abstraction layer, which of course is based on EF Core, it shouldn't matter what database you're interacting with. I will say that it's a little bit more complicated than that. Just for doing straight transactional type of queries, EF Core does a great job at that. You don't really have to do much customization. But when it comes to migrations, which is obviously the provisioning of tables and various entities within various databases, there's enough differences between the different database engines that we actually had to build an abstraction layer around EF Core to support that. Because provisioning is actually a fairly important part of Octane. Like, for example, if you build a module that needs to be installed into the framework, you need to be able to do that in a way that supports any database, right, without a lot of different quirks or customizations. And so that's why it was important to build that abstraction layer. From a security perspective, I think it's a little interesting in the sense that when Octane was created, and actually when Blazor server was announced, and even Blazor WebAssembly, there were a lot of questions, I think, from the community on how security should be implemented using this new technology. And the initial attempts from Microsoft seemed, focused on the technologies that they had available already. So when it came to spinning up a Blazor application and adding authentication and authorization to it, Microsoft would say, well, use the .NET Core identity services. Well, those services, at least from a front-end perspective, relied on Razor pages on the server, right? There was no front-end Razor component model that worked with Blazor. Also, there seemed to be a heavy dependence on JOT tokens for everything, regardless of whether you really needed them or not. It's interesting because in the meantime, the industry has changed its guidance. This backend for front-end BFF security model has become a lot more popular. And for those of you who are not familiar with it, it's essentially relying on cookies. So if you have a server and a client that are running on the same domain, essentially you can use same site cookies, and that is the backend for front-end security model, which relies on cookies, which, at some point, maybe 5 or 6 years ago, it's almost like the industry had declared that cookies were dead and you shouldn't use cookies anymore. And now it's back to saying, yes, you should use cookies. In fact, in .NET 8, Microsoft is going to be introducing a backend for front-end security model for Blazor. So it was kind of nice from an Octane perspective that we made this decision to go in this direction a couple of years ago. And Microsoft is now sort of catching up, and we're not sort of diverging from the best practices, right? In fact, Microsoft is now catching up to the best practices which were already implemented in frameworks like Octane and other types of systems that are out there already. So when it comes to your Octane web client, which could be, running Blazor server or Blazor WebAssembly, and also for the Octane MAUI client, because it's essentially just using an embedded web browser, it can rely on this backend for front-end security model just fine. If you need to interact with other types of external client applications, like perhaps you're building a more traditional Windows client, then you might want to consider still using something like a JOT token, because that still is a better methodology for that kind of a security requirement. And Octane does have the ability to generate JOT tokens as well to accommodate that. As far as the backend goes, again, it's using the BFF model with cookies to talk to backend APIs. But often you don't want to only interact with a local identity store for usernames and passwords. More often these days, you want to use a third-party identity provider. And Octane has the ability on a per tenant basis to be able to specify which identity provider you would like to use. So maybe if you want to use, Azure Active Directory for one tenant within your installation, and maybe use Google for another, or maybe use Okta for another, you can completely do that. And it's just a matter of setting up the configuration through the user interface. I guess the other thing to note is one of the ideas, or one of the sort of goals in Octane, is to minimize the number of third-party dependencies that the framework uses. And so it does not use OpenID Dict or Identity Server or any of these like third-party components. It uses the standard Microsoft components that are provided in .NET Core to provide the interactivity with third-party identity providers for both OAuth 2 and OpenID Connect. Also to generate JOT tokens. So there is some good stuff that's coming in .NET 8, which I think Octane will maybe take advantage of when it comes to at least the generation of JOT tokens, and in particular the refresh tokens. But anyways, this is sort of the overall security model that Octane uses today. The other scenario, which I guess I didn't mention, is if you are using a microservice-based architecture and you have remote APIs that you need to interact with, then JOT is still obviously the best method for that, because typically those remote APIs would be on different domains and couldn't share cookies. And so if you're using, you can use JOT tokens for that as well. And those JOT tokens can obviously still observe the security roles that have been defined in Octane as well. And then multi-platform UI has always been a goal for software developers in terms of, you want to build applications that can cater to the most devices possible. The problem was, in the past, you would typically have to build multiple applications to cater, right? Like a different application for each device. That has largely been solved, I would say, with the emergence of MAUI and Blazor Hybrid in particular. And so I'll be able to show you how that works, but in a moment when I do the demo. But the idea there is that you build Razor components, and if you build your Razor components in a client-server manner, then they will run fine in web, whether that's Blazor Server or WebAssembly, or they can also run in Blazor Hybrid. And that could be either on the desktop or as a mobile application. From a composable UI perspective, the idea with Octane is, and I was trying to explain this earlier, is that everything is completely dynamic. So, you're not building pages as Razor components like you would in traditional Blazor. Octane does have the notion of themes, which is sort of akin to, a master page or a layout in Blazor. It's basically a component that does define the various regions of your page and provide sort of the look and feel aspects to it. And so that theme would basically contain the layout for your content. It would contain elements like a menu, a login, logout control, things like that. Within your theme, you define panes, which would be dynamic areas where content is going to be injected at runtime. Within those panes, you can define through configuration which modules should be injected, because you can have many different types of modules within your installation. And then there's a notion of containers as well, which provides some of the sort of Chrome around the module if you want to maybe change the look and feel or add additional functionality. And I'll explain, this is kind of hard to conceptualize in a slide, but I'll show it to you in a demonstration soon. Modules are developed in exactly the same way that the Octane framework is developed. So, and it uses, if you built a Blazor WebAssembly project, like using the standard template from Microsoft, then you'll be familiar with the notion that you have a client project, you have a server project, and you have a shared project. The client project is where your Razor components go, and your services, which use HTTP client to call your server. Your shared project is where you put your models, and the models are obviously shared between the client and the server. And then you have a server project, which is where your controllers would go, where your repositories for interacting with data would go. And so the result of this module architecture is that you basically compile it and you have 3 DLLs, right? You have a client DLL, a shared DLL, and a server DLL. These DLLs are deployed to the Octane bin folder. And at runtime, when Octane starts up, it basically is able to identify the modules that are part, like that should be loaded, and it loads them dynamically for you. And then depending on the hosting model that you're running, if you're running on server, then of course if they're loaded into the server, then that's all you need to do. But if you're running on a client that's maybe WebAssembly based, that WebAssembly client has to make a connection to the server, and it has to request to download the specific DLLs that are module DLLs that are related to your site. And it'll obviously download them to the client, load them into the app domain where they can be used. Similarly for .NET MAUI, it operates in the same manner, just using slightly different techniques. So Octane's been around for a while. So like I said, the initial proof of concept was developed way back in late 2018. And this was when Blazor was still in its preview stages. Like, it hadn't even reached its 1.0 release yet. The official announcement of Octane being an official open source project and being available on GitHub was in May of 2019. The first official release of Octane 1.0 was released in May of 2020, and that coincided with .NET Core 3.2. Prior to that, it was, in a long beta period as it prepared to have an actual official release. If you notice in this list of roadmap items, the major releases typically coincided with the next major release of .NET. So Octane 2 was with .NET 5, Octane 3 was with .NET 6, Octane 4 was with .NET 7. And in between, of course, there's been a lot of other point releases that were done for various reasons. I think an important one was multi-database support in Octane 2.1, and of course the .NET MAUI support, which was added in Octane 3.2. The most recent release of Octane is version 4.0.2, and that was released earlier this week. Typically, we have a release every month. And the current Octane framework is targeted at .NET 7. We are expecting to have a release available for Octane 5 related to .NET 8 later this year. So I think I've already covered some of the overarching goals, right? Is that it needs to seamlessly support all of the Blazor hosting models, and the idea that the extensions that you develop for Octane are developed and deployed independently from the framework itself. This means that essentially it's different than some of the other Blazor approaches that are available, like application templates. There's a lot of Blazor application templates that are available in the ecosystem that you can download, which provides you with a starting point, and then you can start customizing the code to meet your own needs. The problem with that approach is, of course, once you start doing customization, it becomes very difficult for you to integrate newer versions of that template. Octane is a framework, much like the Blazor is a framework or .NET Core is a framework, right? It's meant to be used as an independent framework, almost like a black box, right? Where even though you can access the source code and you can see what it's doing, you can even debug into the source code, it's not recommended to modify that source code, because if you do that, then you're on your own fork and you're going to have to deal with whatever maintenance or integration you have to, deal with in the future when the framework changes. So if you keep the framework and treat it like a framework and build your extensions independently and take advantage of the interfaces that are available so that you can interact with the framework, then you can build very complex, sophisticated applications and move ahead as the framework moves ahead. So as the framework is upgraded to a new version of .NET, right? That makes your upgrade path a whole lot simpler than if you have to mess around with code and do integrations yourself. One of the things that's a bit complicated for people to grasp when it comes to Octane, and it was the same with .NET Nuke back in the day, is this dual personality. So Octane is a web application framework, meaning you can use it to build web applications. You can also use it to build websites, right? So if you have if you have a need to build just a basic website that just has content in it and doesn't have a whole lot of advanced functionality, you can use a system like Octane for that as well. But primarily, it is targeted at developers. The goal is to never try to compete with like Squarespace or Wix or Weebly or any number of like really powerful site builder tools that are available. If you're building a simple website, then by all means you should use those tools and do not use Octane. If you're building a more advanced website, which has content as part of it and probably has maybe the need to register users, have people log in, have people interact with different types of more advanced modules, that is the type of a CMS that Octane is, right? It's a CMS that's designed for developers because it ultimately uses an application, or it is an application framework. For those of you who, like, this might be going a little bit too far back, but for those of you who are familiar with .NET Nuke, and then some people like to think of Octane as being sort of like DNN vNext. There are some major differences between the two, but there's also some similarities. So the similarities are that both of these systems support multi-tenancy. They were both modular in nature. They were both composable. They were both open source, and they both supported localization out of the box. From a technology perspective, they are completely different. So where .NET Nuke was designed to run on Windows only, it uses the .NET Framework. It only supported a single database, which was SQL Server. It leveraged the ASP.NET Web Forms model, and in fact, still to this day, the fundamental compositing model is still based on web forms. It was a completely server-side application model. There was no client-side concept to it. It was monolithic in nature, and it would only run in a web browser. And I should also say that from a multi-tenancy perspective, it only supported shared tenancy. So if we look at Octane now, it is cross-platform, meaning, of course, it runs on Windows, Mac, Linux. It's based on .NET Core, which, of course, provides that cross-platform capability, supports multiple types of database engines for, at this point in time. From a client technology perspective, it uses Blazor and .NET MAUI. Architecturally, it's a client-server model, supports microservices so that you can break your application down into many different services, and it runs on web, desktop, and mobile through the capability that Blazor Hybrid provides. So although there are some similarities between the two from a conceptual perspective, from a technology perspective, they are completely different, built from the ground up using completely different technology. All right, that's a lot of talking. So let's move on to looking at Octane, the application. So first of all, I guess I'll point out the fact that if you want to learn more information about Octane, there is an actual octane.org website. The octane.org website is in fact built on Octane. So it's essentially eating its own dog food. It is mostly a static site at this point. It has like a bunch of different information related to the framework. It also has a blog module, which has a lot of, the different release announcements and things. But, this would be an example of a separate module, which is running within the Octane framework. If you want to learn more about the code behind Octane, it's on GitHub in the Octane org, within the Octane Framework project. This is where you would be able to download the various releases. And of course, this is where all of the code is maintained out in the open. And there is a bunch of different information that's provided here about how to get started with it. All the information, detailed information about the roadmap and the various versions and what was implemented in those versions, release announcements and various things are all here. All right, so if we go over to Visual Studio, I've got the latest version, so 4.0.2 loaded up. And if we actually look at on my file system here, this is the equivalent of what we're looking at in Visual Studio. So, which is of course the equivalent of what's in GitHub. So in the root folder, you've got a bunch of different solution files here. I am using the octane.solution file. There's a separate solution file for the different database abstractions. There's of course the 4 different database abstractions, which are part of Octane. When you're doing standard development in Octane, you don't have to concern yourself with those. So that's why they're separated out into a separate solution. There's an updater project as well, because Octane has the ability to basically auto upgrade itself at runtime when new versions become available. And I can show you that in the UI if you're interested in that capability. And then of course the Octane.MAUI project or solution is where the .NET hybrid implementation lives, and I'll show you that as well. All right, so if we go back to Visual Studio, if we look in the server project, we have an app settings.json file, and at the top of this file we have a default connection specified. Essentially, this is like just specifying which database connection string is going to be used for running the application. Right now it's set to blank, which is great because I need to do a new installation of Octane. And as long as this default connection string is blank, it will allow me to pop up an installation wizard to run it. So I'm going to go ahead and just run it. It's going to detect that I don't have a database, and it's going to allow me to do an installation. And it asks for some very basic information. So if we look at the databases, It's defaulting to local DB, but you can see that you can choose from any of the different databases that are supported within Octane. I'm just going to use local DB for this. I'm going to create my initial user account, which I'm going to need for logging into the application after it's created. I will add an email address. And we have the ability here to choose a template. By default, there's a couple of templates which are available for basically setting up your initial site. There's a default template and an empty template. You can create as many templates as you like, and they would be populated within this list if that's what you want to do in your own local environment. And once I've made these selections here, I can choose Install Now. And it'll run all of the migrations which are necessary to provision the database that I've chosen here as local DB. And it used that template to provision a set of pages which are part of this initial site. So this is sort of the default look of the default site template. I can go ahead and log in now using that account that I created. And initially, I should probably mention that this particular site, and I can actually show it to you in a moment here, but we're running on Blazor server. So that's just sort of the default option that's used as you're just spinning up the application to begin with when you do your initial installation. You can change that at whatever time you want. So we have a home page, we have a private page, we have a my page. You'll notice that when we first connected to the application, we only had a couple of menu options. The private page required a user to be logged in with credentials for this site. And now that I'm logged in, I can actually see this private page. This page is actually comprised of a bunch of different regions. So if I go click on this pencil, I can see that there's a default pane, which is this main pane that's in the page. And there's a module here, which is this block of HTML. There's another module here, which is another block of HTML, and the third one here. And then we can see that this page also supports a whole lot of other interesting layouts where we can move content to the various regions to set up the layout of the page that we like. Also, if we wanted to maybe edit the content for this particular Welcome to Octane module, I can go into Edit. Pops up a modal dialog where I can, change the content. It's basically this feature alone which makes people believe that, Octane is a content management system, which from a development perspective, it is a content management system. But like I said, you wouldn't normally use this to build just simple websites. You'd use a framework like Octane to build more sophisticated websites that have a lot of rich functionality in them. So that's how a page is laid out with the different regions. I talked about containers earlier. So there's a container that wraps this content. The container provides capabilities like a title for this particular module. It has this action menu, which allows me to access additional features related to this module. So I can go in and I can see the settings for this module. It's the HTML text module. It has a title. It's using this container. I can see who's allowed to view this particular module. So you can configure all of the different permissions, and you can define as many roles as you want dynamically. And then you can control who has access. There's some additional module settings that are specific to this HTML text module. And then there's even some settings that are available to the container, right? Whether or not I want to display the title, I can set background colors, text colors, things like that. So quite a bit of rich functionality there. Since I'm logged in as a host user, as basically an administrator of this particular site, if I hover over this gear icon, I can see that I have access to a control panel. The control panel has the ability for me to access an admin dashboard, which is where a lot of the administrative functionality is located, but it also has features that are specific to the page that I'm on. So example, if I want to edit the page characteristics, I can go in and I can see that, this is my home page. It's in the root of my site. It's in the navigation, meaning it should be displayed in the menu. It's got theming capabilities, so it's using this particular theme. I can set up meta tags and other types of content to go in the head. I can add script tags to the body. I can just define who is allowed to view this particular page. In the page management modules, the modules that are located on this particular page are displayed. So like I said, there's 3 modules that are on this page. And then the theme has settings as well, whether I want this theme to show a login link or a register link. So that's page administration. Of course, it's all about modules in Octane. So I have a series of modules which I can choose from. So let's say I want to, have an HTML text module and I want to add it to the default pane. I can just choose whatever module from this list, say add to pane, and it'll add it to the content of this page. Like I said, this is all configuration because at runtime, it looks at the configuration and it assembles the page dynamically. If I go into my control panel and my admin dashboard, we can see that there's a lot of functionality that is provided by default by Octane. So site settings. So Octane is multi-tenant. So, and the concept of a tenant is synonymous with a site. So you can have many different sites. If I go into site management, I can see I only have a single site, and that's the site I created by default when I did the installation. I can add an additional site here if I want. We'll just call it test, and we'll give it a unique URL saying that when I go to this subfolder test on this particular domain, I'm going to treat this as its own independent site. I'm going to use, let's use the Blazor theme that everyone's familiar with. And I'll use an empty site template for this one. And in this case, I'm going to have it Blazor WebAssembly as the hosting model. And I'm going to just put this in the same database. I'm going to share the same database as opposed to, I could also create a new database if I wanted to. So this is how I would keep my data isolated from one another if I wanted to for different sites. But I'm just going to use the same database. So if I say save, it created a new site at localhost 44357/test. That it's using the Blazor theme, which is the standard one in the Microsoft template. It only has a single page in it called home, no content in it because it was a blank template. Because it's on the same domain, I'm still logged in, of course, because it's using cookies. And I can go into my admin dashboard and I can see in my hosting model that I'm using Blazor WebAssembly. So this is how you can, of course, have different sites that are part of your installation. So now I have 2 sites. I'm going to go back to the original site. I'll browse to it. So in site settings, you've got the ability to define things like all different types of configurations. So you've got things that you would expect in any sort of website that you're building, right? Meaning you've got like the ability to generate a site map based on the pages that you define in your site. You can define a logo, which would replace this logo here. You can define a fave icon. You can define which theme that you're using. You can define your meta tags and things that you want to use across the site. You can define SMTP. So if your site needs to send email, there's an email notification service that is part of Octane. It runs on a background scheduled job. And you can set up your specific delivery information for SMTP for this particular site here. You have the ability that a site can actually operate as a progressive web application as well. In order to do that, you have to have certain icons that are required for a PWA, and then you can enable it. You can have many different URLs that point to the same site. So example, if you had like a few different domain names, maybe some vanity URLs that you wanted to use, they could all point at this same site. And this is how they would basically create the route table so that they get routed to the right place. In page management, we can see all of the different pages which were created as part of this site. So you've got the pages that were part of the menu, and then you've got the pages which are the admin pages, right? Site settings is the page we were just on, page management. Everything is defined at a page so that it has the same exact security model. So I can actually go into the site settings page, and I can see that administrators can view and edit this page and no one else can. Right, so this all follows very consistent paradigms when it comes to defining the pages that are in your site. User management. So a lot of sites have the need to have a community of users. And like I said before, you can set up users locally with local username and password if you want, using the .NET identity capability, or you can also set it up with external login as well. So if I wanted this particular site to use maybe an OIDC provider, I can go into my external login settings for this site, and I can basically fill out the information that would be provided or would be required for this, for an OpenID Connect provider. Maybe it's Okta, or maybe it's, you know, Microsoft Azure AD or whatever. I mean, you fill out the information, and from that point on, when a user goes to log in, they will have an additional login capability that they can use. And you can, of course, also choose to turn off the local login as well. Other things you can do is on a site-by-site basis within your installation, you can say whether or not that site supports registration by anonymous users, allows like local logins, requires two-factor authentication. You can define the complexity of your password settings for this particular site that's part of your installation. You can define the lockout configuration as well, in terms of when a user should be locked out after how many failures and things. So a lot of rich functionality. Token settings as well. So this is where you can set up your JOT token secret so that it can issue tokens, which can be used for external clients. Profile management. So if you're going to use users, then most likely you're going to have a user profile that you want users to fill out, and it's completely configurable as well. So you can add as many different profile settings as you want that are part of a user profile, and you can group them together, you can order them, and you can do validation on them as well, in terms of whether they're required or, you know, whether they have a regular expression for validation. So a lot of rich functionality for defining your user profile. Whatever you define here, if I go into my profile section, it will be displayed here automatically for you. So just a lot of stuff that's built in for you in terms of managing users. Also have role management, where you can define as many different roles as you might be using in your organization. File management. So it also has a service so that you can manage files related to this particular site. I can create folders, and it's got, right now, it's got the ability to have both what we call private and public folders. Private folder means that the files are stored in a location on the web server which are inaccessible and would need to be served through an API, essentially. Public would be files that are available in a www root, which are basically publicly accessible if you know the URL. So, and you can define which users are allowed to access specific folders through the folder management area. And you can upload files. And of course, your modules have the ability to use the file manager as well. A recycle bin is very helpful if you delete pages from your site or delete modules from pages and you want to restore them. So it goes into a recycle bin first. You can restore from there, or you can permanently delete from the recycle bin. URL mappings is helpful if you are migrating an existing site to Octane. because your existing site would have had very specific URLs, and you're going to want to map those URLs to specific areas within your Octane site. The cool thing here is that if there's URLs that are mapped into your site that are essentially broken, right? They don't go to the proper location. There will be a 404 error page displayed, but it'll also log the URL to let you know that you have a broken URL. You can find it in the list, and then you have the ability to map it where it would become a mapped URL. So this is super helpful if you're doing site migrations, right? Because you're going to have a ton of URLs, random URLs often, that need to be mapped. So this is essentially your URL mapping / rewrite capability. Octane also has the ability to have visitor management. This is something that you can enable or turn off, but if you want to just track visitors who are coming to your site, it'll basically track just the IP address, of course, and some very basic browser information. Also tracks, because it drops a cookie, so it tracks the number of times that particular user or visitor has visited the site. The visitor management feature is also really helpful for anonymous user personalization, because there's a whole API behind it. You can store whatever settings you want related to visitors, which is stored in the database and, of course, associated to a visitor cookie. Of course, if the person erases their cookies, then they'll be treated as a new visitor. However, it does have the ability as well to correlate visitors. So if it sees a visitor coming from the same IP again, it can correlate that back to a visitor that previously existed. So it just depends how you would like to use this, or maybe you don't want to use it at all. But it's quite helpful in terms of giving you information that perhaps Google Analytics wouldn't be able to give you. Event log. So Octane has a very robust event log, meaning like every event in the system is logged. So we can see here that we installed the application, so that it was logged. A site migration was executed, which was creating my initial site, so that was logged. Even login events are logged, so I can see that maybe, login successful for username host, right? So it keeps track of like every log out is also logged. Everything is logged, and you've got a nice UI that you can look at to see the different types of levels of logging, the types of functions, right? Whether it was a create up function, whether it was an update, whether it was a read, whether it was security. And so you've got all this information available. And then you can also specify how many days of log information you want to retain in the system, and it'll clean out logs that are older than that for you automatically. We covered site management already. So module management, this is where it starts to get interesting. So if I go into module management, these are all the different modules that I have created. A lot of these are custom modules that I'm working on locally. If I want to create a new module, there's a concept called a module creator. So I just create, and I can provide some very basic information related to this module, and I can choose a template, and it will scaffold out a complete set of code for me, including project files, solution files, command files, everything that is needed to create a fully functional module. It'll create it in a folder that's beside the Octane Framework folder. You can open it in Visual Studio, you can compile it, and then you can basically see what a fully functional module looks like, and you can use that as a starting point for creating your own modules. The idea with Octane, though, is like other people may have created modules that you might like to use in your site. So if I want to just install a module that is already existing, there is a marketplace which exists for Octane. And so other developers have created modules like a form builder or an announcements module, which are available. These ones are available as open source modules, so they're free. You can simply download them into your installation. So fair number of them here. The commercial aspect is going to be launched probably within the next week or two, meaning there'll be the ability for developers to build commercial modules for Octane, which will show up in this commercial view. And you'll be able to actually, as a user, you'll be able to purchase the module. And there's a whole lot of other services which will be provided around that as well, for commercial support, commercial licensing. All of that is going to be released shortly. So I expect that this is going to take off probably a lot more significantly once there's a commercial option, because I know that this was a very critical aspect of .NET Nuke. There was a whole ecosystem of third-party developers that were building extensions for .NET Nuke and customers that were utilizing those extensions. So that is coming soon. Theme management, same kind of idea here. You can create a theme by scaffolding it. You can also install a theme. And there's a couple themes that are available by third parties. And again, there'll be a commercial option for that soon as well. Language management. So I mentioned localization much earlier in this presentation, but Octane is fully localized, meaning there's resource keys that are defined for every element within the administrative UI. And there's a number of different language packs that have been created. So what you can do is you can go into language management and you can add a language to your installation. Once you've added the language, there's also the ability to dynamically download a language, like a translation pack, which will fully translate the user interface into whatever language you've chosen. So localization is there. Scheduled jobs. Once I restart the application, there would be a list of scheduled jobs here. But it's very simple to create scheduled jobs in Octane. Actually, let me go ahead and close this and then just restart it. And then I can at least show you. So scheduled jobs. So by default, Octane comes with a notification job. So this is the job which runs every minute and delivers notifications via email. So for all of the different sites that are part of your installation that have SMTP settings defined, it'll use the scheduled job to deliver them. So it does it in the background asynchronously. Obviously, there's nothing that's run yet. There's a purge job that runs every day, and this purge job is designed to clean up the event log and various things so that it basically does housekeeping for your system automatically. So events, visitors, and notifications. So, and you can build your own scheduled jobs. This GitHub projects job is in fact what the .NET Foundation uses. There's a project called dnfprojects.org, which identifies all of the different .NET Foundation projects, and every day goes to GitHub and harvests metrics related to number of pull requests, number of issues, things like that. And so that's implemented as a scheduled job within Octane, and it works like 100% reliably. SQL management. If you want to run SQL queries against your backend database, you can do that as well, as long as you are a host user. So this is helpful for troubleshooting various things. Of course, you could remove this if you don't feel like it's something that you would want in your site, but it's especially quite helpful also in development scenarios. System info. This gives you a variety of different information about your installation of Octane. So what framework version, so 402, what CLR version, what machine name is, some of the paths to files in your file system, what time is it on your particular server, how much memory is allocated. You also have the ability to set some options, which would be set in your app settings file. Like if you want to have more detailed error information, or if you want to only log errors and not like information and above. There's also a file logger for things that are that run basically during startup that are not associated to a particular tenant. Because tenant resolution happens, you know, it doesn't happen immediately. There's things that can happen earlier than tenant resolution, and those need a place to be logged as well. And the last thing is system update. So this is what I was referring to earlier. So if you are running an older version of Octane, it will check to see if there's a newer version available. And if there is, it would give you a button to say upgrade. What that would do, it was download the latest release to your server for you. And it would actually do an auto update. So similar kind of capability as what you might have in something like WordPress or other systems like that, which basically can simplify the update process. Because that is obviously one of the most painful things when it comes to framework, is keeping them updated. And so we've tried to make that as simple as possible. So you can also, you know, if you don't want to use the automated download mechanism, you can also just upload the NuGet package and it will upgrade it as well. So a lot of capabilities that are part of Octane. We have this site running right now, so I'm going to switch over now to Maui. And so I've got the Octane Maui solution open. A couple things to point out here with the Maui solution. So we have this Maui constants file. Maui, of course, is going to run within some kind of a client application. Right now I have it set to a Windows client application. If I had Android installed, I could run it as inside of an Android emulator or an iOS emulator. But regardless of how you're running it, there'll be an embedded, basically, web browser, which is essentially how Blazor Hybrid works. And you need to tell that web browser which address it needs to navigate to, because obviously you don't have an address bar that you can type it into. So the constants file within the Maui solution allows you to do that if you want to hard code it. If I go ahead and run this, it's set to blank, as you can see here. And it tells me, oh, you must either set up the URL in the Maui constants, or I have the ability, I can also set it in a local storage location, which is specific to my Maui client or Windows client. Okay, so if I close that, I can take like this URL here, and I can go to that location that it said, and I can open this app settings.json file, and I can add that URL, and then I can go back to Maui, and I can run it, and boom. Okay, so basically my Maui client application, my Windows client, is pointing to my web server, which is running, and it's able to get access to, obviously it rendered all of the content. I can also log in to this instance, similar to just exactly the way that I did in my web browser. And I have all of the same functionality that I have in my web browser, except now it's running in a Windows client. And of course, it's like the exact same application and components, which are running in all these different environments. I can close this, and I can go back to, and I can, I had that second site that's part of that installation, right? So I can add that extra bit of URL to it, go back to Maui and run it. This time it should run the other site that's part of my installation, which it did. So like you can also make it work with the multi-tenant aspects of Octane as well. I think an important thing to understand is when you're running in Maui, like on startup, it's obviously going to run the Maui client, but it's also, it needs to download much in the same way that when using Blazor WebAssembly, you have to download the DLLs to your browser and then execute them. When you're running in Maui, it has to download those DLLs to whatever the client device is. In this case, it's my Windows machine. And then it has to load them into the app domain, and then it runs your application, and that all works. When it comes to Maui, Octane is smart enough that it stores the files on the device's local file system. And then the next time you go to run the application, it's going to check to see if there's newer versions of the DLLs which are available. If not, it doesn't download anything. It just runs. If there are newer versions that are on the server, it will download them. So it has this auto updating capability that's part of it. This is built into Octane, and it works for both Maui and Blazor WebAssembly. And this is like quite helpful for like scenarios and organizations where, you know, maybe you've installed this Maui client on a bunch of different people's desktops, and then there's a new version of your application, right? Instead of having to install that new version onto everyone's desktop, you can just drop your module DLL into the server bin, and then as soon as that client reconnects, it will download the latest version of that DLL, and it basically does self-servicing for you from a central location. So that is also quite a powerful capability that is included as part of Octane. So I think that that's like a whirlwind tour of all of the capabilities of Octane. And so I guess at this point, it would probably be best to find out if there's any questions.
Hey, I have a question, Shaun. How about in the Maui world if we need to access anything from the device?
So
any sense like I don't know, like the accelerometer, gyroscope, or GPS, or anything that we need to use? Are we able to use Xamarin Essential, Maui Essentials, and everything that we have available there?
Yeah. So the Blazor hybrid does have like the ability to access the capabilities that are part of the local device. So obviously, if you built a module for that purpose, then it wouldn't be a module that would be running like in a web context. It would only be designed for Maui, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like, but yeah, I mean, the same. So Blazor hybrid contains its own set of libraries, of course, for accessing device-specific services, like you mentioned, camera, various things. And you could build that type of a module using Octane. But then it would only really run within the context of a very specific environment, right? You wouldn't be able to run that same module in a web browser because that device doesn't exist in the browser. So, but yes, that would be possible.
Nice. It has a lot of great features. Octane, Shaun. Really impressed with everything that you can accomplish there.
Yeah, obviously it's taken quite a lot of time to get to this point. And I think, so building modular and multi-tenant applications is difficult. And so to build something like this from scratch, obviously, like it's taken 4 or 5 years to get to this point. So if you are contemplating building such an application with .NET Core and Blazor, then obviously I would highly recommend you leveraging something like Octane as opposed to trying to build something from scratch, because it's a lot more work than I even imagined it was going to be.
Now, it definitely seems and it looks like a lot of work. I will have a question. Steve is asking if there is any limitation to containerizations about using Docker or any type of container and so on.
So I have not, I'm not running in containers in any of my installations. I believe that there are some people who are, but it really depends on how you do the configuration, because a lot of times Docker containers want to be static, right? So they want to have an image that is pristine, right? And it's not going to change at runtime. The whole concept of a dynamic framework is like you might need to upload a file, right? Like, and in those scenarios, then sometimes, depending on your Docker configuration, it just doesn't work, right? In some ways, Docker doesn't allow you to do those types of things. So you would have to figure out how to do the configuration if you want to use Docker.
Got it. All right, I think that will be. I do, and we do have built our fair amount of multi-tenant applications, and they come with a set of difficulties for sure, and also with a lot of set of design. And let me just ask you a few things here. For example, sometimes you have to build some multi-tenant applications that they can share, like a common table. Let's say they share clients, or they share product, or so basically they are in different databases, but they have some common table, like they have like a shared repository for those type of things. So how will we go about that here in Octane? Exactly the same.
Yeah, so
module, or
no, so so you could build modules that use its own dedicated database, or even, I guess, a shared database with some other site or some other service. That would be completely possible. I guess where it would be more complex is because essentially you're not using the native multi-tenancy capability then, right? You're using some sort of a custom, I don't even know if you'd call that multi-tenancy, right? It's more like you want to share some data, or you want to store some data in a different table. Like I have, for example, I have, I'll show you here. So this site here I have, because I'm a hockey fan and I play hockey, but so this site is built using Octane, and it tracks NHL hockey statistics for all the players across various seasons. This is an Octane site that's part of a multi-tenant installation, but all of the data for all of like the players and stuff is stored in a completely separate SQL Server database. And so this module, this hockey stats module, talks to that separate database to get its data. That's like not hard to do. It just needs a connection string. So it uses the multi-tenancy aspect only for the sake of figuring out which site in the multi-tenant installation it's part of, what pages are part of that site, and that's about it. But the data itself, which is like the data that's specific to this module, is stored in a separate database. I think that's what you're asking, right?
Yeah. Thank you.
Yeah.
Yeah, and we have another question. When we're building custom modules, do we have access to the admin panel functionality from code? Meaning that if I'm building a module, but I want to check something from the configuration or something from that admin panel, is that available?
Yeah, because it's completely like a headless model. So all of so what you saw, which was the, do I still have that open here? Yeah, so all of the functionality that's in here, these are all, of course, the UI front ends for the admin, but there's corresponding APIs on the back end, right, to serve all of the information for these. Like, so if I want to, get information for a user or add a user, there's an API for that, and there's also a service library on the client that you can use so that you can interact with the library on, like, the API on the back end much more simply. So there's APIs for everything that's here that you could use from within your own modules.
Nice. I have to say, Shaun, I'm really impressed. And I remember again when Blazor started, and this was already a whole project, and there is a lot of things that we have to think about here, about loading assemblies, about registering services, about I don't know, a lot of dynamic pieces that are just really, really interesting. Also, when we're using third-party components, if we're using Syncfusion or we're using DevExpress, we use a lot of DevExpress ourselves, and we need to register things on the startup.
Yeah, so that's it can be a little tricky using third-party UI components because each of them have their own like nuances for what's required. The main thing is, if you're building a module that's external, right? Like the idea with Octane is you build your module outside of the Octane framework. And so that would mean that you are referencing NuGet packages, right, in a completely separate project outside the Octane framework. And so when it comes time to deploy your module into the Octane framework, you have to make sure that you copy all of your third-party dependency DLLs, your whatever static assets might be, like JavaScript files, CSS files. You have to make sure all of those end up into the appropriate location within Octane, or else it's not going to work. And that's what most people get tripped up with. Like, if I show you like a very simple scaffolded module generated with the module creator, right? It generates a bunch of code for you. So it generates a client project, a server project, a shared project, and a package project. This package project is important because if we look in here, essentially what the package project does is when it does a build, it builds client, server, and shared, and then it does a post-build step in this package project, which executes this debug.cmd file, which copies the DLLs and the PDB files from this location where they exist, right, which is at the same level as my Octane framework, to my Octane framework bin, right? And so this is all scaffolded for you automatically, and it seems like it's magic when you scaffold a module, you compile it, you then run it within Octane and it works, but it's relying on things being copied. And so if you're using like third-party dependencies, you got to make sure that you're copying those same dependencies to the appropriate location. And if you're using JavaScript and CSS, those also have to get copied, right? So this is where it's not anything really to do with Octane. It's just you have to understand your deployment model, right?
Is there any documentation about that, Shaun? Or we just email you if we
so documentation on how to, like, so if you go into
like on third-party components, because we do like heavily use them. So I think that that will be one thing that we get stopped quickly.
Yeah, so I think if you go into first thing,
there's Syncfusion.
So there is like if you go in here, people have asked this question before, other people have answered it already. So nice. You'll find information on Telerik, Syncfusion, Radson. I think that those three for sure, there's answers on how to integrate them.
Nah, and a lot of them are pretty similar. They just like we copy some
Blazor.
JavaScript.
Yeah.
Nice.
Yeah, so I would first look like, because this is sort of like a knowledge base, or it's a good repository of questions that people have asked before.
Hey, let me ask you something else. We have a questions here about, let's say that you are not a developer and you just want to install it, because there is a lot of things out of the box there that I think that without building a custom module, you can create pages. How will be that process? Or the only way is through Visual Studio?
So depends, I guess. Deploy to Azure works. So
Nice.
click this button and it'll deploy it to Azure for you. Of course, it'll ask you a bunch of questions about resource groups and various things. If you want to install it onto, onto IIS, so if you're not a developer, you probably need a developer to help you, because you're not going to really understand IIS and how to deploy things then. I use Azure for almost everything with Octane. I find that it works really well. And you can run Octane in like one of the smallest tiers. So yeah, so I think that like an Octane deployment could cost you maybe $20, $25 or $30 a month. However, it's multi-tenant, so you could host 10 sites on that, right? So then it's down to like $3 a month. So
nice.
It definitely works well for that perspective.
I think that that's it. I don't see any other questions. And again, there is a lot of things here. I think that you can basically, let me ask you something else. Except for like static pages, what will be a scenario that you will not recommend Octane? Because basically, I think that you can do anything here for line of business application. This is a perfect. And so what will be one scenario that I will not recommend it?
Good question. Yeah, I can't think of, like, for any type of line of business application, it should work fine. If you're building like a game or something, maybe that might not be a good use case. I haven't really thought about what it wouldn't be good at. I mean, almost every type of application is these days are storing information to some kind of a backend data store, displaying that information somehow. Yeah.
I believe it's really powerful, and you have basically a lot of features out of the box, so you can focus on your business logic.
Yeah. So I see this question here. Create a custom cron job with functionality specific for that module. That's what the scheduled job functionality is for. So you don't need to use a cron job. You create a Visual Studio, or not Visual Studio, sorry, you create a scheduled job class within your module. At runtime, Octane will see that class, spin it up, and run it as a hosted service. And you can specify in your installation like the schedule that you want it to execute on, right? Whether it's every minute or every hour or every day or whatever. So you don't have to know anything about that's one of the ideas here. You shouldn't have to know a lot about the infrastructure, right, to be able to create a cron job. Everything within Octane is essentially writing C# code, whether it's backend, front end, scheduled jobs, it's all C#.
Nice. All right, Shaun, do you have like some like Twitter contact information if anyone wants to get a hold of you?
Yeah, Absolutely, yeah. I mean, I think so. You can use that Shaun.walker@devessence.com.
Nice. All right. So, hey, thanks a lot, Shaun. It has been great. A lot of things to go through there, and an awesome example of how dynamic Blazor can be and how powerful it can be from the client side and from the server side. So, really excited to see the presentation and to see everything that you have shown us. A lot to think about, a lot to play with. So, thank you a lot for the presentation, and for everyone, thanks a lot as always for joining in. Next month we have now we're going to be talking about CSS for Blazor developers. That's not the part that at least I shine the most. I like C# in CSS and front end. It's just like not my cup of tea, but it's needed. It's needed for Blazor and make applications beautiful. So thanks again, Shaun, and really grateful for having you here. I know that everyone was talking about today about this talk. I'm pretty sure everyone who was not here is going to be missing out, and they will definitely be watching on YouTube later. I don't have anything else. Thanks again, and see you guys next month.
Thank you all. Appreciate it.